The designer is communicating something to us that we're made in such a way that the living God can satisfy the longings of our heart. We're made by God as well. J.I. Packer is an author. Says, I am the God who is jealous to protect something supremely precious. That's who we are. He's jealous of us because he's protecting us who are supremely precious. I'm a jealous God. And it's not in the sense of how we would ordinarily use the word jealousy, not as something as possessive or insecure or like a easily threatened lover. God's jealousy is a holy zeal to protect something very precious. We find idolatry, we find this like all over the scriptures. It's supremely important to God. It should be important to us as well. We find this in Deuteronomy chapter 4. When God gives the law to the people of God, he says that this is the embodiment, and this is how, of first importance, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all of your strength. Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5. These are kind of hallmark verses. And when it comes to the worship of God, this is of supreme trust to him. We find this in the book of Joshua. We find this to throw away gods your forefathers worshipped in Egypt. And we find him just commanding the people of God to continue to forsake all other gods and turn to the one true God. And serve the Lord. Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. And this is the way it was even on Mount Carmel. We find this in the book of 1 Kings as well with Elijah. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. And when Jesus was born, we're going to walk towards this season together. When Jesus was born, there was no room for him at the inn in Luke chapter 2. But today we might think that there's plenty of room for him in our own lives, and maybe there's a penthouse suite in there. But the question remains, is Jesus the Lord of our lives, or has he become more of a cultural custom than he is than the true Christ? Have we misplaced his lordship for something else? Maybe we put ourselves at the center of our own lives instead of Christ. Because when Jesus is truly Lord, he's the supreme authority in all of our decisions, our values, our priorities, everything else. And far too often we just serve our own idols. Whether it's the pursuit of freedom, the pursuit of an image, false sense of self, perhaps, we're pursuing that. A really helpful book and resource is Counterfeit Gods. It's by Tim Keller. And he says, what is an idol? He says, it's anything more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give you what only God can give. So how can we identify this? And he goes on to say, a counterfeit God is so essential and essential to your life that if you should lose it, your life would hardly feel like it's worth living anymore. So what controls your thoughts? What breaks your heart? These questions can reveal what we're truly worshiping. And here's some of what he suggests of some of idolatry, power idolatry. Life has meaning if I have power and influence over others. What about approval idolatry? Life has meaning if I'm loved and respected by blank. What about comfort idolatry? Life has meaning if I have certain pleasures or quality of life. Statements reveal things of what our heart really does chase. A couple more. Helping idolatry. Life has meaning only if people are dependent on me. Independence idolatry. Life has meaning if I'm free from obligations. Or what about dependence idolatry? Life has meaning if someone there is to keep me safe. Can subtly take the place of God in our hearts, because achievement can be an idol. Life has meaning if I'm only excelling in my work. Or image. Life has meaning if I only look a certain way or if I have a social media presence. We make relationships idols too. Life has meaning if Mr. or Mrs. Right is in love with me. He understood, Paul, the Apostle Paul, we're going to find him talking about idolatry. He's in New Testament, talks to the New Testament church. He's challenging and he preached boldly against idolatry. We can make this an idol. He's challenging the culture that they had placed their worth in some things in the church outside of God. We can make work an idol. Not just obtaining a profit, but our identity comes through our work by how much we worked or how hard we've worked. We might find that life is only meaningful or successful if my children are successful, then I'm worth something. We can turn that into children being means to our own ends. You see, sometimes idols just aren't statues or shrines or anything that takes central place in our lives, eclipsing the grace and glory of God. Think about what fills your imagination or your mind. Have you made an idol of yourself, placing your desires above God's because He hasn't maybe answered your prayers the way that you want Him to? This turning away from God is expressed in Colossians chapter 3. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. We often think graven images and golden shrines are idols, but idols can take the form of placing anything central to life other than the grace and glory of God. And if it's an idol, it probably has your time, imagination, and places lens on your worldview. What gives you comfort when you're distressed? What do you do when your soul's troubled? Do you go to food? Do you go to alcohol? Do you go to drugs? Do you go to binge movie watching? What is it in your life, if God took it away, would turn you from God? What is taking the central place in your life right now? What do you turn to for comfort and identity and joy instead of God alone? It's important to recognize these attachments because they reveal something potentially of idols in our lives, because they can become subtle. It's ultimately a thief of joy. When our hearts cling to other things other than God, we begin to sacrifice true joy for temporary satisfaction. You know, some things can be inherently okay things, but we can elevate them too high. Career success, relationships, security, comfort, our own image, etc. It looks like the normal things of life, elevated just a little bit too high. When our hearts cling to those things, we're sacrificing something eternal for something temporary. Apostle Paul, in the book of Philippians, it's in the New Testament, Philippians 3, he says, "Whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord, for whose sake I've lost all things. I consider them garbage that I may gain Christ." And he considered all of his earthly achievements garbage compared to the worth of knowing Jesus Christ. His career as a Pharisee, his reputation, his religious accomplishments, the amount of churches he planted, none of it compared to the true joy of following Jesus. You see, what might God be asking us to let go of so we can experience that kind of freedom in our own life? What do I love more than anything else is the question for us. And found his joy in the Lord, and despite persecution, because his heart was centered on the gospel. Have we allowed ourselves to sacrifice joy for just lesser things? You might be saying, well, okay, what are the steps I need to get here? Like, how do I kind of walk towards this, right? You see, the writer here is Paul. He knew his audience. He knew this. It wasn't this gospel message. The gospel wasn't just a message for him. It was a way of life. And for us, it begins with a choice. It begins for us to examine our own heart, to turn away from what distracts us, and to lean fully into the joy and the purpose that God has for us. We find in this few section of verses taking God's name in vain. And this is more than just misusing his name in speech. It's about treating God's name as empty or powerless or a tool for our own purposes. God's name is tied to his presence and his authority. And when we misuse it, whether in what we say or how we live, we diminish the relationship that he has for us. One way we take God's name in vain is we can use it to manipulate, to attach his name to things that he has not simply ordained. This happens when we justify actions, when we seek influence, or we advance an agenda by claiming this is of God when it may not be. It's a perversion of his authority, twisting his holy name into something that is very much self-serving. And to be honest, I am a member of the church at large, the Christian church. We're not exempt from this. Throughout our history, we have seen actions carried out in the name of Jesus Christ that were very far from his heart. There have been times wherein the church at large has misrepresented Jesus Christ. And instead of reflecting on his mercy and his love and his humility and his power, we have sometimes used his name to legitimize human desires. His name is not ours to wield for personal or worldly gain. It is to be revered and glorified, always aligning with his truth and purposes. God's name carries infinite authority and power. At Philippians chapter 2 reminds us, at the very name Jesus, every knee shall bow in heaven and on earth, under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. And sometimes we take God's name in vain when we live in a way that does not square with his name. How often have we not lived up to God's name, being revered in a way that we live and act and speak? I mean, we're taught this in the Lord's Prayer. Jesus' prayer for his church, his disciples, taught them how to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. That's the first line. It's a request to bring his name real on earth as it is in heaven, to have his name revered. And we honor his name by making him first. We bring honor to his name when we practice mercy. We bring honor to his name when we're patient in the process of sinners being redeemed. When we give ourselves to the marginalized, when we give ourselves to the needy. We bring honor to his name when we enter into someone else's suffering. God's the suffering servant. When we practice hospitality,